About a week ago, I did a video on 7 interesting and unusual friendships and relationships between football clubs across the globe. It was one of those videos that I find interesting, but normally crash and burn when I upload them. But happily, it seems other people actually found the topic quite interesting as well. The top comment on that video, from subscriber Stavros P, was the suggestion of doing a similar video on 7 strange or unusual football rivalries. Bizarrely, this was actually harder to research than the other one, and I've no doubt that there are loads of peculiar rivalries from across the globe that I still don't know about, and I thoroughly expect particularly some of our foreign or overseas subscribers to let us know about some really interesting ones in the comments. To be clear, a rivalry between, say, AC Milan and Inter Milan, or Liverpool and Everton, is pretty easy to understand. The two clubs are basically next door to each other, thus creating a derby. Similarly, rivalries such as the one between Real Madrid and Barcelona, or Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich are also easy to understand, as hugely successful clubs who develop competitive rivalries due to regularly facing each other and battling for trophies. Albeit, there's obviously a lot more than just footballing reasons behind that Barca-Real rivalry. Anyhow, those are essentially the two typical types of rivalries, and this video is interested in examples that on the face of it make no sense whatsoever. Here are my 7 bizarre, strange, or unusual football rivalries. Uruguay versus Australia. Real Madrid and Barcelona have faced each other 242 times in all competitions over the years, whilst Liverpool and Manchester United's meeting this afternoon will be the 203rd time the two clubs have met in competitive fixtures. That's sort of what we expect of rivalries. It makes sense that you can only really maintain a mutual dislike and competitiveness if you face one another on a regular basis, and yet the international rivalry of Uruguay and Australia is the one that gets us started in this 7. Uruguay is a tiny football-adoring South American nation that, against all the odds, won the first 2 World Cups the country entered and have won the Copa America more times than either Argentina or Brazil. Australia is a vast nation, historically uninterested in football, preferring sports like cricket, Aussie rules and rugby. Nevertheless, the record between these two, who have faced off a mere 9 times, reads 4 wins for Uruguay, 4 wins for Australia, and 1 draw. The first competitive meeting of the two came in the semi-finals of the 1997 Confederations Cup, which Australia won, although Uruguay exacted some revenge 4 years later when they knocked Australia out of 2002 World Cup qualifying. The rivalry really stems from the exact same set of fixtures 4 years later in the 2006 World Cup Interconfederation playoffs though. Uruguay beat Australia 1-0 in the first leg in Montevideo before both teams headed to Australia for the second leg in Sydney 4 days later. Australia won that game 1-0, meaning the game went to penalties, where Australia's golden generation pulled off the greatest achievement in the history of Australian football, or soccer. The two teams have met just once since in 2007, which Uruguay won, but this rivalry lives on despite 12 years without the two teams meeting. North Carolina versus LA Galaxy. Football rivalries in the US may not be quite as old or rooted in tradition as some of those in Europe or South America, but there are still some passionate ones out there. The likes of the Seattle Sounders versus the Portland Timbers, or New York Red Bulls versus New York City FC both have a little bit of fire in them, but there's one rivalry that requires a bit of a backstory to get your head around. The lack of promotion and relegation in US soccer means rivalries seemingly ought to only be divisional, but there are still cup competitions. That's exactly how LA Galaxy and North Carolina FC, some 2,500 miles apart, developed a rivalry over the last decade. To put that in perspective, a round trip from the Galaxy's home in LA to the soccer park in North Carolina would take you 74 hours, or a little over 3 days, of non-stop travel by road. The distance between the two is the same as the drive from Madrid to Moscow, so it would be fair to say this one isn't really a local derby. North Carolina FC, formerly Carolina Railhawks, play in the USL Championship, the second tier of US soccer. On paper, they should be no match for the second most successful side in the MLS, with LA Galaxy having won a record 5 MLS Cups. Nevertheless, for 3 seasons in 2012, 2013 and 2014, North Carolina were drawn against LA Galaxy in the US Open Cup every season. What's more, North Carolina beat their much esteemed opponents every time. This rivalry is a funny one, in as much as the two sides could never face off again, but North Carolina can take pride in being one of the US's biggest club's bogey sides. Norwich City versus Wolves. You have to feel for Norwich, who are a little cut off from much of England and don't have a great deal in the way of local rivals. The East Anglian derby is obviously Norwich's fiercest rivalry, and even that's a fair old trek. The rivalry between Norwich and Wolves is a lot less intense, but does still exist, and is a fairly bizarre one given the 3.5 hours separating the two teams by car. The dislike is a fairly recent one, beginning in 1998, when Wolves defender Kevin Muscat left sprightly young Canary striker Craig Bellamy with a puncture to his kneecap with a horror tackle. A well-known thug on the football pitch, Muscat caused a string of long-term injuries through his cowardice tackles, and threatened many more. Norwich weren't willing to forgive Muscat for the challenge on Bellamy, and Ewan Roberts exacted some revenge on Bellamy's behalf 2 years later. And thus, a little rivalry was born, albeit a slightly one-sided one, and Norwich fans took great pleasure in their side beating Wolves in the 2001-02 Championship playoff semi-finals. The rivalry has largely died down since then, with Norwich fans slightly split on whether Wolves are genuine rivals of theirs. They did sing a song involving the line "We only hate Ipswich and Wolves" for a while though, so I think this one is a worthy entry. Iran vs South Korea. A case could be made for the footballing rivalry between Iran and South Korea not being that unusual, but I suspect it's one few of our subscribers know about. Outside of football, one might expect a fractured relationship between the two nations. Iran has long had close ties to North Korea, South Korea's neighbours, who routinely threaten to wipe them off the face of the earth, and a nation they are technically still at war with, while South Korea has had a strong relationship with the United States, a superpower that has long been at loggerheads with Iran. Nevertheless, Iran and South Korea have somehow managed to have pretty good relations in diplomatic, political, and economic terms, just not so much on the football pitch. The rivalry really began in the 1970s when Iran and South Korea were regarded as the two strongest national teams in Asia. Iran went undefeated in 6 meetings with South Korea between 1971 and 1988, winning 3 consecutive Asian Cup titles during that time. They have met even more frequently since the turn of the millennium, playing out really closely fought contests, which Iran have tended to edge. Key games between the two in terms of developing the rivalry include the 1972 Asian Cup final, which Iran won 2-1 after extra time, a 4-3 win for Iran at the 2004 Asian Cup in China, and a couple of draws in 2010 World Cup qualifying, which saw South Korea qualify for the finals in South Africa, whilst Iran missed out. The most recent meeting between the two countries, who are separated by over 4,000 miles, was a 1-1 draw in a friendly in Seoul in June of this year. In total, they have met 31 times, with Iran having won 13 and South Korea having won 9. Gillingham vs Swindon Town. Around 2.5 hours separates English lower league duo Gillingham FC and Swindon Town, and despite playing each other regularly for around 80 years, there was no ill will between the two. Up until 1979 that was, a season in which both teams were fighting for promotion from the 3rd Division. Both games between the two that season will be fiery affairs, and I mean really fiery affairs. In the first leg at Priestfield, a 2-2 draw was overshadowed by a red card shown to Danny Westwood. Incensed by the decision, one supporter ran onto the pitch and punched the referee, knocking him out. The return fixture would be no friendlier. Gillingham had a player sent off once again as Swindon won 3-1, but a fight in the tunnel after the game meant Swindon coach Wilf Tranter had to go to hospital with injuries to his face. 2 Gillingham players ended up in court due to the incident, and a rivalry had been born. The hatred is generally regarded to be stronger from Gillingham towards Swindon than from Swindon towards Gillingham, with the Robins having a much fiercer rivalry with Oxford United. Gillingham have a rivalry with Millwall, but some supporters consider Swindon to be their fiercest rivals. The rivalry was intensified as the two teams met in the first 3rd Division playoffs in 1987, with Swindon winning in a replay. Both teams have tended to fare well in their home games against the other, and Gillingham are now in League 1, while Swindon are in League 2. Hansa Rostock vs St. Pauli. There are some pretty heated rivalries in German football, such as Dortmund vs Schalke and Hamburg vs Werder Bremen, but the rivalry between lower league duo Hansa Rostock and St. Pauli has been described by some as the most hate-filled and vitriolic in the country. What's stranger is the fact that these two aren't near neighbours, at all in fact, with 250 kilometres of German roads separating the two sides. Many of you will be well aware of Hamburg-based St. Pauli and their strong stance on progressive issues and fan culture. Just this week, the club parted company with Turkish midfielder Cenk Sahan after he did a social media post supporting Turkey's invasion of Kurdish-held territory in northern Syria. St. Pauli supporters generally identify as being left-leaning politically, taking strong anti-racism, fascism, and homophobic stances. Fewer of you, I suspect, will be aware of the politics of Rostock, which is a pretty city in the north of Germany. Rostock has a large number of far-right and neo-Nazi residents, stemming from an anti-immigrant mentality that arose after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Rostock struggled following German unification, erupting in 2 days of xenophobic riots against migrants in 1992, which was the biggest in post-war German history. Hundreds took part as thousands looked on and cheered. Around this time, St. Pauli travelled to Rostock for the first time, and it won't surprise you to hear that it wasn't a peaceful clash. There was fighting in the stands and riots after the game, and a bitter rivalry has ensued ever since. On occasion, Hansa fans have thrown bananas at St. Pauli's black players, shirts have been set alight, and flares fired into away ends. This is sometimes described as the most heavily policed game in the world, with one officer for every 20 fans, and it has to make this 7. Brighton vs Crystal Palace. Current Crystal Palace manager Roy Hodgson says he doesn't remember there being a rivalry between Palace and Brighton when he first started supporting Palace in the 1950s and 60s, and that would make a lot of sense since an hour of English motorway separates the two teams. Having said that, up until Crawley Town won promotion to the Football League in 2011, Palace were actually the closest Football League side to Brighton, slightly nearer than fellow South Coast outfit Portsmouth. Roy Hodgson is quite right when he says there was no rivalry back in the 50s and 60s, however, since the feud between these two kicked off in the 1970s. The rivalry began with a heated clash during the 1974-75 season when crowd trouble blighted a 1-0 Brighton win at the Goldstone Ground. Things intensified later in the decade as both aimed for promotion from the 3rd Division under rivals and former teammates Alan Mullery and Terry Venables, and things really turned sour during an FA Cup tie in 1977. Brighton's nickname of the Seagulls even stems from this rivalry, previously nicknamed the Dolphins, after they sang Seagulls back to Palace fans to mock the opposition fans whilst they sang Eagles. In 1985, Palace defender Henry Houghton broke Brighton favourite Jerry Ryan's leg in 3 places, an injury from which the Irishman would never recover. Several instances have exacerbated the rivalry since then, and both teams are now experiencing a rare spell together in the top flight. The record between the two sides is incredibly tight, with Brighton having won 40 games, Palace having won 38, and 25 ending in draws. That's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Feel free to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, in fact please do, and make sure you're subscribed to HITC Sevens, and head over to www.englandsgreatestdefender.com to have your mind blown by the best football book ever written.